Good day, Industrial Advisor listeners, and thank you for tuning in. If you have not subscribed, please do so by clicking subscribe wherever you podcast. Click the like button and hit the bell if you want notifications of when we put up new content. Leave us a comment about anything we discuss here today or general comments about the show. Now, let's get into it.
Welcome to our Industrial Advisors podcast. Today, you have Bill Condon and Matt McGregor, and we have a great guest, one of our favorites, Bret Swango, who's Senior Vice President and Head of Location Intelligence and Workforce Analytics at Colliers. And Bret's always on the road presenting, talking, innovating. And today's topic that we're going to talk about is labor. And Bret is one of the most knowledgeable guys that we have at Colliers on the current state of the labor market. So it's great to have you with us to discuss this important topic in today's environment, Bret. So thanks for joining us.
Of course, always appreciate the opportunity to help on with you, Bill.
So, Bret, thanks for being on the show. This is your second appearance. You were with us at IAMC, so thanks for being a repeat guest on the show. I'm excited on this topic because there's so many things going on in the labor markets, both nationally and globally. And really in this podcast, I want to, dissect some of the rumors related with some of the macro level stuff, but let's dive in on the macro level. Can you provide some color on the macro factors impacting the industrial sector overall, and kind of like the effects of having, what labor is having on location selections for today's, large users in the U.S. market related with overall labor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really, it is the macro world, right? And so labor, like any other market, is just that. It's a market, right? Driven by supply and demand. So kind of the four big pillars that we're seeing, I call it driving, the economy at large and consequently the labor narrative. You've got the political, you've got the environmental, you've got the technological, and you've got the demographic. So, I mean, starting with the political, obviously the geopolitical conflict, and I'll call it maybe tension that we are having with China right now. And I'll call it just the broader deglobalization that's taking place, across the economy. That paired with this, I'll call it environmental challenges, which I think it's going to be interesting to see, again, what impact this has. I'm here in Chicago for the last week and the last couple of days, and it's not the first time this happened this summer, but, we've dealt with this haze from the fires up north. I've got a sister who lives up in Canada, and that's honestly become kind of a new deal for her, even in the last 4 or 5 years. And so now to see some of that sweep as far south is much of the United States being covered by that. I think this environmental thing is increasing. And even if you look at just ESG trends broadly, the uptick that we've seen in those over the pandemic, and now with, I'll call it more like cost of capital pressures, that seems to be waning a bit. But, so then, okay, how does this geopolitical plus this environmental, well, then you see the things like the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The bipartisan infrastructure legislation, the CHIPS Act, between those three acts, you've got essentially $3 trillion worth of government incentives plus. And that number kind of, depending on who you talk to, there's a different number there. But just to put that in context, domestically, we historically have a $23 trillion economy, and our government budget through most of the 2010 was $3.5 to $4.5 trillion. So that's a company not saying, hey, I'm taking a portion. I'm not taking 60% of profit. I'm taking 60% of revenue, and I'm essentially making that available now to, really we're seeing two broad categories where a lot of those funds are going. It's really defense and green energy. Right. And so on the green energy side, you've got the EV battery, the solar. And then on the defense side, you've got obviously a lot of narrative on the semiconductor, the aerospace, and then I'll call it chemicals or other chemical inputs that we, maybe some areas of fragility that we noticed in the supply chain, right, on things that are mission critical that we want on shore. So how does that all impact, manufacturing and or the labor market in the United States? Well, China is, they're a decade ahead of us. Maybe that's a stretch, but call it 5 years ahead of us from a green energy perspective. And part of the infrastructure legislation is that the funding from that huge bucket of dollars, a lot of it really starts to burn off over the next 6 to 8 years. And part of that legislation was also that a large percentage of the goods have to be produced onshore. Well, if the folks who are developing that at scale are in China today, and they have to be onshore, but the funds are only available for a limited window, what is that doing to industrial? It's driving up demand for existing manufacturing product.
So Bret, that was like 3 master's classes in the last 90 seconds. Let me ask you this on this, dumbing this down a little. You just said a lot about, how to get these funds, what we're dealing with. I know we're going to touch a lot on China, but let me ask you this question about the U.S. labor force. Where did it go? Because prior to COVID, I didn't hear about all the labor problems. And then you had COVID, and post-COVID, there's like no labor. Like everybody is like, we can't find labor for almost anything. And so what happened to the U.S. labor market?
So I think it's as much as anything, it's a number of different factors. So the one, I touched a little bit on the political, I touched on the environmental, obviously the technological, I think you're reading a lot about that with AI and all the just the heavy power requirements from a lot of these users. The last one is the demographics, right? So, and I think, in a prior presentation I gave with you, Matt, we talked about the 60-20 ratio, basically looking at the percentage of the population that's over the age of 20 relative to, in their 20s versus the percentage of the population that's in their 60s. This is a 2017 number, but I think almost 70% of boomers are financially supporting their 18 to 39-year-old kids. And boomers control 70% of the wealth in the United States.
Wow.
So we've got the baby boomer generation they're now entering retirement. I think the median boomer hit like 65 last November. And so that segment is going away, and the 20 somethings, right, that are the product of the silent generation, the two big home in the U.S. demographics are essentially the boomers and millennials, right? And then in between them, you have the silent generation and Gen Z. So we're in a persistent labor shortage from now on. Everybody's saying how the labor paradigm is swinging back in favor of employers. I mean, we're still at relative to the last 30 years. Basically, we're just off our historic highs. There's still 9.5 million job openings in the U.S. I think we peaked at maybe 11. And there's, roughly 6 million people unemployed. That are unemployed and seeking, seeking meaningful employment. Again, that's partially due to some political things, right? I mean, obviously, as Charlie Munger said, some version of show me your incentive and I'll show you your behavior, right? So as you make some of the, obviously there's still, I think, some of the, I don't know what you want to call it, but basically economic funds that were given out by the government that are still haven't been pulled totally out of the system. So the labor force participation rate is down, but it's really just it's a top line problem where there just aren't enough people, right? And then along with the not enough people, you're also seeing that, every presentation that I give, I essentially ask the audience, hey, raise your hand if you think the world is changing faster today than it was yesterday. And everybody raised their hand.
Everybody, yeah, for sure.
Right. So it's like, if you got the world changing faster, that means that the skill sets that are needed are different than they were yesterday, and the rate of change is continuing to accelerate. So that disconnect between the skill sets of the labor. So not only do you have a smaller labor pool, but the relevant skill sets in the labor pool, there's a disconnect between what's needed and what people have. And we don't see that going anywhere. There were many people born, I was born in 1990. There's been as many people born globally since I was 4 years old, since 1994, as we expect to ever add before we hit peak population globally. And essentially 100% of that growth is Africa. Like you got the whole rest of the world is basically flat. And then you got Africa where that growth is going to come from. So it's like this labor shortage is not going anywhere anytime soon. And then, the other kind of lever there, right, is okay, well, what is technology or AI or automation do to it? It's definitely going to have an impact. I think that's still TBD, but yeah.
So if that's where the labor come from, not to get you too sidetracked, but is that why China is so interested in Africa? Is they're trying to tap that labor pool because of their issues? And I know we're going to get into that.
It's a brilliant, look at what they've done with Africa, South America, basically all these emerging economies. They're essentially saying, hey, you're poor. We now, even wages in China are up in the manufacturing sector are up 8x in the last 20 years. 8 times, right? So wages in China, you're looking at 14, 15-ish $1,000 a year versus Mexico, I think, is about half that. You got like Thailand and, Vietnam are about half of Mexico, roughly $4,000 a year. So as China has been going up in income, right, they've been pushing their influence saying, hey, we have this massive population. We don't necessarily have the resources here. Where can we go that has resources? Whether that's, today, I think a lot of it is tied to again, green energy. The fact that they were a decade ahead of us, you start to hear about the lithium mines and all these rare metals. I mean, how often were you hearing this narrative even 3 years ago in the US? It just wasn't a thing.
It wasn't there.
And so China has been playing chess while we were playing checkers with this. Hey, here's where the world is going. Okay, where are those things controlled? And then what kind of deals can we get these groups who are living on, way less than $1 a day? What kind of deals can we strike with them because they have lots of resources? And then, and we need those resources for where our industrial complex is going. And then, I call it the ancillary effect of that is now they have all that control on these giant population centers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's where, and you asked me about this before, like Peter Zian says, hey, China's doomed because they've got this demographic cliff coming. And I'm not one to prognosticate on how much that is. I mean, it makes sense to me logically. My big concern is that they know they have this big demographic cliff coming.
They have to.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I don't know, and it's a terrible analogy, but it's kind of like you've got a hostage who's basically running out of air in the place that he's inside of. And he's already shot you've got a guy who's taking people hostage. He's already shot one of the hostages. So he's running out of air. So he knows his clock is ticking. Like, you fear the guy. And my dad always told me this as a kid, like, stay on a fight because you never know when you're going to end up in one with somebody who's got nothing to lose. Or when that guy's got nothing to lose, that's the guy who's really dangerous. So that's the scary part to me about both Russia and China is that they know they have these challenges coming.
Interesting. And I know we've talked about this, and Billy, I'll let you go. I know we've talked about this, but I didn't know about why they were focusing on Africa. I thought it was resources. I didn't think of the labor component, but I certainly know, and we've talked about the influence China has had on Mexico, because if you go over the border into Tijuana, where a lot of this manufacturing is moving to. So we're thinking we're getting out of China and going into Mexico, but half the buildings are Chinese owned in Tijuana, and they're clearly controlling it. And then they get the free trade as opposed to the tariffs, right? Because it's coming up out of Mexico for taking advantage of NAFTA, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It is a increasingly complex dynamic. One thing I think that's like a little bit of I'm not saying it will be a trend, but we're kind of hearing some canaries in the coal mine, if you will, regarding this, starting to see some, I don't know what to call it other than I'll call it maybe anti-China sentiment at the state level. Some of the stuff that's happened in Virginia, Alabama, Detroit or Michigan. So like as that starts to percolate, we're doing a ton of work with Chinese firms who are now saying, hey, we actually want to start looking in blue states. Right. And what is the key? Because essentially the Southeast is largely quote unquote sold out of existing manufacturing products with significant power. So I think that's an interesting trend because it's like, if you think about, peak manufacturing domestically, I think it was like 1979. And then, in the first decade of the 21st century, we essentially lost about a third of manufacturing jobs in the U.S.
Yeah.
So there hasn't been this growth, and what growth there was largely in like some of the West and the Southeast. But now you're seeing, hey, these blue states all of a sudden are, dude, I think there's a case just based on the tenant activity that we're seeing where they're actually starting to see some renewed interest. And I think it's a unique opportunity for some of these legacy assets in these markets that have heavy utility.
Bret, you've talked a little bit about China and the U.S., but let's talk about Mexico a little bit more in depth in the labor situation there and what you're seeing.
Yeah, so Mexico, I was down in Mexico City for almost a month earlier this year. Spent some time with some of our colleagues, just trying to get my arms around, what was happening down there. Was this whole onshoring real? What is the requisite skill level? And, we're certainly seeing it. I think, the border towns are the major beneficiaries. I think, Puerto Laredo, I think that's a very interesting area. I think San Antonio is actually a really interesting, I'll call it going back to the domestic side of who domestically is potentially going to benefit from some of this push into Mexico because, Puerto Laredo was already the biggest port, but, it's a pretty limited labor pool there. Yeah, the relative affordability and the long-term that Mexico presents, which, again, like anything else, it's a market, right? So knowing that there's a strong supply coming online with the, just due to the age of the Mexican population and the size, I think it's I think it's going to continue to be a real growth lever. And it's just and frankly, the other thing I'll say is, in work ethic within certain, there's different stories and it's very geographic, right? Regarding, I'll call it the quality of labor, both from the skill and a work ethic perspective. But I'm just so impressed when a lot of the conversations that I was having with the general population there and their desire for it to work, which I think is another more social challenge that we maybe face here in the United States, just with the, kind of the general entitlement, but I think those are all kind of natural evolutionary features that, will eventually work themselves out.
Let's come back home and touch a little bit on, let's bifurcate the U.S. to what are the best areas for, labor right now, manufacturing and distribution. And then with that, what are some of the worst areas and challenges?
Yeah, well, so it's, like any, because again, this is a market, right? And like any market, that's saying, hey, what part of the, what industry should I be investing in? Or maybe said differently, what geography, the US or Asia or Europe? It's like, well, that's a complex dynamic, right? And it's a ever changing market, but I'll go to the advanced manufacturing side. And, I think Texas is really well positioned. It's kind of the, it's the center of basically the Americas, right? And I think it's going to be a massive beneficiary of some of this, the lower cost alternative you'll call it the global decoupling from China. So I think it's going to be a beneficiary. The relative affordability, Matt, this is some stuff I was just working on for a client of yours. The fastest growing from a cost perspective has historically been, the West and Northwest over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And the Southeast is still the most affordable. I'll call it the Midwest is probably from an engineering high-end labor perspective. If you look at the top engineering schools in the country, the percentage of them that are in the Big Ten, again, depending on what list you look at, you're going to always see probably half, right? Because that is just, that's where kind of between the Rust Belt and then also, the automotive manufacturers. That's essentially, you start in Detroit and then, you maybe go over to the Carolinas, but then you go right through Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, and then all the way down to the Alabamas and the Mississippis, where you're going to see more affordability, but maybe a little bit lower quality from a skill set perspective. The other big piece of this narrative, because it is hey, what is the best, right? Which is essentially, hey, where do I get the best talent for the lowest cost or the most value? That's second. I talked a lot about hey, where's the highest quality talent? The other piece is the cost side, right? And I know we've talked about this in the past. The relative affordability of housing, I still think that is a major issue. And even if you look at the top factors in the site selection criteria, Area Development does a really great survey. And if you look at what's really elevated in their list, it's quality of life, right? A big part of which is affordability, with the point there being is that, hey, if you're in a relatively affordable, high quality of life market, if you move there as an employer, even if that labor pool isn't there today, because, the beginning of our conversation was about how there isn't a big pocket of available labor anywhere. But if you go to those markets, it's kind of if you build it, they will come because, so many people are being priced out of major urban metros right now. And I think the wider bifurcation, I think there's a small segment. And if you look at the capital allocators, this is where they're putting money as well. There's a small segment of the population who's less price sensitive than they've ever been, because they're making it, because they've benefited from these historically low interest rates and asset value appreciation. But there's a larger segment who, can't even afford a home, right? I think, we went from, in 2020, 60% of the United States could afford the median house that was sold. Fast forward to 22, and between appreciation in prices and interest rates, that number got cut in half to 30%. So I say that to say I think it's a really unique opportunity for some of these more affordable communities who feel like they've historically been kind of left behind to enhance their value proposition from an educational perspective to say, hey, even if we don't have the skill set today, we can build them in the future. And that's the conversation we'll have with, because again, battery, solar, I mean, even the aerospace side, like these aren't areas that have historically been, busting the scene in the United States the way they are today. So a lot of this curriculum has happened to be created. So with those community colleges, we call them the 3 C's, who are the companies looking for? What do the communities have that are trying to lure those companies? And then how can the community basically help, you got the companies, you got the communities, and you got the colleges, right? And how do the colleges help fill that gap between what the companies are looking for and the skill sets they want and the skill sets that the communities have? And those areas that are most effectively able to integrate that, the Arizonas, and what they've done with their community college system, Ohio, the Jobs Ohio folk. I was just on a thing with the head of the Texas Workforce Commission. I was on a panel with him, what Texas has done. I think it's a really unique time where going back to that disconnect between the skill gaps that, people have and that companies want, those areas that are most effectively able to kind of bridge that gap are going to really benefit.
I really think out of all of our discussions and my research, the U.S. is not extremely well positioned to get out of China because of our challenges with our labor force. So how does automation and technology in manufacturing and even distribution play a role to help us?
I mean, that is the $1 million question, no doubt. I mean, and if you look at, I was joking with somebody the other day that the data center is the new office. And they're like, wait, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, a lot of that work that was done in offices historically is now being processed via data centers, right? So I think that the automation, and I mean, even with the requirements that we're seeing, I'll go again back to the manufacturing side. A lot of them are fairly, there's some really high-end engineering intensive components. And then a lot of it's like lower skill community college talent pool. So I think, unquestionably, and I mean, you're always, once a week, I feel like I see something from you on LinkedIn about someone with a new fully autonomous warehouse. So what that curve ultimately looks like is hard to tell. But what we do know just from the demand perspective is that, the demand for power is way up. And that's because I think a lot of those machines are doing a lot of things that people used to be doing. So what does that curve ultimately look like? And when does that inflection point hit to maybe help relieve some of this, this labor pressure? I'm not sure, but it's definitely not a short term. And I don't know even if it's a medium term possibility at this.
Brett, I got a question with, the labor topic. What's just your overall take on the return to the office and what the hybrid model looks like in the future and how that's going to play out?
So I think it's actually fairly straightforward. It's essentially technology inherently enables fewer people to create more value in the world. Nobody really wants to hear that, but that's the nature of the beast, right? Is that it enables scale, which goes back to Matt, why I've been saying, I think if world changes faster, it's going to be really good for the really good people, right? And the average person, it's not going to be as good for. So if you're a company who has really good people who want to work remotely and are effective remotely, and you try to say, hey, you have to come back to the office, those people are going to, they're going to leave your organization. But what most companies have is they have very average support people who want to be remote and aren't doing anything remotely. And those companies are going to go away. And that's because capital isn't free anymore, right? So I think that actually the market is going to work itself out with that. But the other thing is going back to, again, the fundamental principles of how the world is changing is the world has changed at an increasing rate. And not one person that I know thinks that their company is as agile being fully remote or even frankly, like in a remote first, like hybrid manner as they were when they were in person.
I mean, it seems, Brad, like in the major cities, it's pretty much back to normal Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, but a lot of people are still like Monday, Fridays going in.
Right. Well, Bret, it's always fascinating having you on, your insights into both the global labor markets as well as the U.S. labor markets and dealing with everything related with the geopolitical issues, globally. I'm going to put all of your contact information in the footnotes. If you're a tenant, manufacturer, distributor, and have any labor questions, analytical questions, Bret's your guy. I'll put his contact information there. So Bill is coming to us live from Othello, Washington, where he is. I'm amazed he got through this podcast without a bunch of boys running in his room. He's coaching in the state playoffs once again, 9-year-old this time last year. He won the title in the 10-year-old reigned, right? Bill, 10,
That's 9 and 10 this year as well.
9 10 this year. So there's 4 teams left in state. Bill plays tonight his team played Magnolia All-Stars plays tonight at 10. So great. Best of luck to you, Bill. And you probably got a house of kids there, huh?
Yeah, we're in our place in Acadia. The tournament's in Othello. So there's kids running around and been a fun run. There's 4 teams left, like you said. And hopefully we're going to be the last one standing.
I almost jinxed you last night. But there's this phenomenal app called Game Changer. And Bill's like, well, you can watch the game, man. I'm like, what do you mean I can watch the game? He's like, download this app. And sure enough, it's like, not only is it video, but it's audio and it's got an announcer and it's got all your, pitch count and I mean, it's unbelievable, right? So I'm watching this game and Bill's team is killing him. It's like 8-0 and it's only 6 innings and like it's the 4th inning or something. So I started texting Bill. I figured he was bored in the dugout. So I'm like, this team's not coming back, right? And he's like, don't jinx it. And literally all of a sudden bases loaded. All of a sudden they score like 5 runs. They got 2 guys on. I'm like, what just happened?
We won that game 9-6. The bases were loaded and we turned a double play to end the games. That game could have easily gone the other way.
Totally. I mean, it was right there.
After Matt said that,
I'll be shutting up tonight.
Yeah. Not a word.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, Brad, you're awesome, man. Thanks again for joining us.
Oh, of course. No, always appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Good to see you, bud.
All right. Cheers,
Thanks, Brad.
Take care.
Yeah.